This morning I was watching David McBride, who is the SAS whistleblower who came forward about the Afghanistan war crimes, and I put war crimes in quotes because war is a crime. But I was watching him on his YouTube channel. He was thanking people for the 30,000 signatures, the petition that he's put forward for charges to be dropped against him for exposing war crimes. And in the comment section I put, David, all the people who sign your petition, they should also be supporting, they really need to also support Julian Assange, because he's a publisher whistleblower, he's a publisher journalist, and he helped expose war crimes by the US empire, and via Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower. And so all Australians should be supporting Julian Assange. And he liked that comment, which I would hope that he would. I don't know if he's mentioned Julian Assange in public, but and this is the thing, this is how Australia treats whistleblowers.
Yes, I joined the Australian Defence Force in 2005. I became a major, a legal officer, and I went to Afghanistan with the Australian Forces twice, once in 2011 and a second time in 2013, attached to the Special Operations Command. And it was with my time at Special Operations Command that I had concerns about what was going on in the Defence Force, in Afghanistan and the war in general. And I started to make internal complaints about what I saw and what I thought was very misleading conduct on our part and the possibility of war crimes being covered up. My complaints didn't go anywhere, and I was shunned, and eventually I fought this sort of organisation for a few years. I left and with post-traumatic stress disorder, mainly from sort of fighting the organisation. And then I became a whistleblower. I gave some documents to an Australian television channel. They did a story in 2017 called the Afghan Files, which at the time was a very big breakthrough. It detailed war crimes, it detailed questionable cover-ups, and it laid bare, it surprised the nation, I guess, that what we thought was going on over there was not going on over there. After the Afghan Files were published, the police, it was quite obvious the information must have come from me. The police raided my home. I left the country and I returned. I went to live in Spain and then to avoid extradition. Then I came home in 2018 to face trial. I was arrested at the airport, and I've been awaiting trial now for about 2 years, I guess, and it won't be on till next year. It's a slow build. It's a bit like if you imagine that you're in a relationship with someone who was a serial killer or something, and but they're very charming and they're very good at covering their tracks, and you would give them the benefit of the doubt for a long time. And I was, in a certain extent, in love with the military. I thought it was. I'd always wanted to be a soldier. I thought that the militaries of the Western countries like America and Australia were basically forces for good in the world, and grew up on the legends of Second World War and the Greatest Generation and things like that. So it didn't. I was very much an insider, and I wasn't about to suddenly, turn against my own country overnight. So it took a while, but 2011 I started to get my first concerns that the war was more about winning appearances and winning approval for domestic audiences than actually trying to make a difference for the people in Afghanistan. It was a small thing, but it was disturbing in that we put up a lot of PowerPoint presentations about what we were doing and how we were making the world better and how we were going to win the war. And I could see there was a real cynicism in the sense that it didn't matter whether it was completely detached to reality. We might have been killing civilians or going backwards. We were getting less popular each year but we were putting out PowerPoint presentations saying we were getting, things were going well. And it was the exact opposite to the reality. I didn't do anything then. I was just concerned that the war was actually being run purely as a kind of charade to impress domestic audiences. There were these bad guys over there, and we were killing the bad guys. And as long as it looked like we were killing the bad guys and building schools, people would vote for us in Australia. And I think America was much the same. The reality of it was we were the Australians were only there for quite cynical geopolitical reasons. We were there because the American government asked us to be there. And as a result, we didn't really want to make a difference to the people of Afghanistan. We needed to have photo opportunities. It became kind of an Instagram war where it depended on how many likes we got. Like the Insta famous person, and we might have a photo of a school being opened or something like that. And the reality of what we've done was often quite different to the photo op. And I was concerned, but I didn't do anything then. Because I was only a major, you're a middle-ranking person in a large machine, but I went back in 2013 with the Special Forces, and things were confirmed for me then when I could see that their own government were leaking things to the press, which they thought were helpful. And they were covering up things. For example, it was the worst of both worlds. We were covering up true war crimes where people had been murdered, and that in order to sort of create a sort of happier image, we would investigate something that we knew wasn't going to go anywhere. And we would inform the press and say, oh, well, look, we've investigated this incident and we're taking this kind of thing very seriously. But at the same time, some very sinister murders of 10 people had happened over there. So we were sort of saying, look at this, isn't this great? Whatever you do, don't look at that. And we were a victim of our own publicity. They had a very famous soldier who had a very big reputation, and the government had used him to sort of popularise the war. They'd given him a lot of medals, and he was a very good self-promoter, and he talked up a lot of things. One of the things that really turned me is I looked into one of the cases, and I found out he'd been awarded a bravery medal for a situation where it actually killed an innocent shepherd boy who just happened to be walking in the area, but they said, oh no, this shepherd boy was a spotto for the Taliban and he was trying to outflank us, and the reports got more and more exaggerated, and so he ended up getting a bravery medal, which for something which was actually a murder. And to a certain extent, it was a small example of the whole war. We were talking ourselves up as we were doing something heroic or whatever, but it was actually quite the opposite. We were killing innocent people and giving ourselves medals for it. And I found that was very sick. And even though that was a one incident, I could see that was happening all the time. And the reason it was happening was because the politicians were only interested in good news stories. They would talk anything up because they basked in the glory. Everybody who committed more troops to every government who committed more troops to Afghanistan was re-elected. It was a vote winner to drop bombs and to be fighting the bad guys. And as long as nobody found out, the politicians really did not care what actually went on in the country. There's quite a lot of links to my case with Julian Assange, and I, again, because I was very much inside the tent, it took me a while to really warm to the whole WikiLeaks thing. But the more I read about it and the more I saw, I could see it was absolutely right. And I agreed with him on the big picture scale to say it was never about individual war crimes. I mean, that will always happen. And if you can't afford soldiers to kill rebel bombers, you shouldn't be sending troops to, thousands of troops. They had 100,000 US troops in Afghanistan at one time. Obviously things are going to go wrong. That's not the big problem. The big problem is when the governments are covering it up. the governments are using it, telling a very different story to what's going on. That's when we're heading towards dystopia. And that's one of the things that WikiLeaks showed, to say that pretty much nothing that we think is true in the world sphere, in the Middle East where there's wars, is actually what is true. A lot of the war is being sort of popularized by the sort of techniques that you would use to sell, washing detergent. We do focus groups and say, oh, it looks good, these kind of bombs look good, or saying we're going to fight Iran. And it become quite dystopian, where the war was being run for the benefit of either getting domestic votes or military contractors. And what that boils down to on the ground was that soldiers were murdering people, saying that they'd done something heroic, and nobody was questioning it. And I felt quite sickened by it. And so I showed that we were lying in a lot of our public statements. We were not deliberately not telling the public the truth. I had to show that we were not following our own procedures. And I said sometimes it was quite subtle, and we would investigate a person who was clearly innocent in order to cover up, as a kind of bait and switch, in order to cover up, from someone who was clearly a murderer. As I said, so I complained about the fact that we weren't following our own laws, because I could see that was some sort of a subtle indication that something was very wrong, and we were covering it up. And as it turned out, I probably stumbled onto more than what I realised, because they did not want to hear that. I thought you would have thought that a logical response would have been, oh yeah, we can see what you're saying. We aren't following our own laws, and we are doing things just for show. We are doing a lot of media manipulation or whatever. They might have, but it was possible for them to admit minor faults and say thank you for picking up whatever. But they really attacked me. My career was over. I was moved sideways. I was sent for psychological review. I've recently read an American book called Crisis of Conscience, which is a very good book about whistleblowers, and it deals with a lot of cases from everything from the nuclear industry to banking and whatever. And I saw a lot of similarities, and it was quite heartening, because when you don't play along with the narrative of a big organisation, they do everything they can not to argue with you, but to silence you in other ways by sending you for psychological review. They did that 3 times to me. I kept passing, and that seemed to annoy them. The psychologist would say, well, look, he's angry about what he thinks is going wrong, but he's not crazy. But that wasn't the answer. I think they eventually sent me to a psychiatrist who tried to gaslight me and tried to tell me that it was all in my imagination. And I recently read that there's a dedicated program for that in government departments, which they've copied from America, to say, and it's called something quite cynical, like it's all your fault. How to make whistleblowers, think that turn them, basically question their own sanity. Yeah, they directed me to go and see a guy, psychiatrist. He was very smooth. And it wasn't apparent. He put me on antidepressants immediately, which really slowed me down. And he was charming and everything, but he said something quite strange, which I didn't realise at the time. But he said, because I explained to him my situation, and he said, "Oh, look, you should," he didn't even say you're sure. He said, "You're just someone who is used to getting what they want in life, and now you're angry about it, and that's why you're angry with the organisation." And it was when you're seeing a psychiatrist, of course, you don't. It's a bit like my relationship with the military. You don't immediately, think the worst of them. So I was like, well, maybe that's the case. I didn't think that I had a sense of entitlement, but I thought, well, possibly. And then later on, I said to him after a few minutes, I said, look, I need to go on with this whistleblowing. I said, it's what is going. I hadn't seen the press at this stage, but I said, what is happening is wrong. And he said, no, you don't have a legal leg to stand on to to report it. And at the time, I thought that's strange for a psychiatrist to be giving me legal advice. And I tried to argue it. I said, well, surely if you worked in a hospital and patients were being killed by a doctor or whatever, you would report it. And I tried to appeal to him, and he was like, no, you've signed a confidentiality agreement. You don't have a legal agreement. And I didn't realise it at the time, but only this year there was a report by an Australian investigative journalist into the Australian government, and they found other cases of whistleblowers within the taxation department who managed to prove that they had been gaslit, if that's the right word, by the government, and that they had a program where they paid psychiatrists to put ideas in people's head to say it was actually all their fault, and they got like a sort of a bonus if they could convince the person to drop the case. Yeah, imagine I could have killed myself or something, and this guy's a well respected person, and you'd think, would you really go that far as to try to it's quite disgusting. I thought it was more there was a bigger story going on in that it wasn't so much about the fact that a soldier might have shot someone either by mistake or even deliberately in the field. It was that the government knew. The government they did inquiries. It's even worse than the individual murder. The government would do an investigation, and then they would deliberately put pressure on the investigator to find nothing, to say everything was okay. And they were using sophisticated media messaging to try to make everything look fine. I thought it was the government who were the truly sinister party, I thought. And I can understand why, in retrospect, it was kind of too big a story for the ABC to take it. And actually, it's turned out well, because as a result of the Afghan files, a lot of things have started to fall down. But the government wanted to control the narrative. I think they knew about serious war crimes back in 2006, and they awarded bravery medals to this famous guy in 2000, and did like the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor in 2010, and they heard complaints from his fellow soldiers then, and they just didn't want to know, and they continued to cover up obvious complaints about the famous people, and they put, as I said, the innocent people on trial in order to look like they were doing something. So everything was about the press train, and I think because they were trying to justify the war, because the war was good for votes. First thing I got onto was, as a lawyer for the Special Forces, I could see that we were doing investigations of people that had done nothing. And it wasn't just my speculation. I mean, they never got charged, but we made a big fuss for 4 years. Sometimes we kept people's lives on hold for 4 years, and we did press conferences saying that they were guilty and they were really bad people. But it was a smokescreen. It was all a smokescreen to cover up the absolutely cold-blooded murders. And that kind of sickened me, that we would not only cover up murderers, but we would try to punish the innocent. And it was mainly because the politicians were worried that if famous people got convicted, that they would have their careers damaged as well. It was a huge amount of cynicism, and to the extent that they, even though the Afghan files talks about war crimes, and even though I talked about war crimes, and the government are now prosecuting it, they still want to put me in jail because they're annoyed that I've spoiled the narrative. They wanted to. What they tend to do is, when they probably learn it from the Americans, it's a very when they have a problem, they think, what are we going to do? We're going to we will beat it up really big. It's a bit like starting a fire and putting it out yourself in order to be the hero. And so once someone is compromised, we will punish him. We'll make a huge deal of it, and we'll punish this person. And by making this big fuss, hopefully no one will look at our part in it. And that's that kind of cynicism. And this is what about my case. It's linked to WikiLeaks in the sense it's not so much about Afghanistan, which it is, but I mean it's about the next war. In the sense, if we don't cotton on to these techniques of manipulation and realise that everything we know about the war is manipulated by the government in order to make us think a certain thing. I mean, even if they're punishing someone now, they're doing it so you can to manipulate your feelings. And one person that no one who's the one people who are never going to get blamed is the government, even though they may have been. They may have been complicit. They may have, all the way along. Luckily, a lot of soldiers are joining me in agreeing to say the government knew everything we were doing all along. Now it's convenient to punish us because it will save them. But there's a darker thing going on where the government was using the troops for political advantage, and now they're kind of punishing them for political advantage. But it's really a sort of a game of shadows where the public are not necessarily ever going to hear the true story because it's manipulated.
Instead of, the whistleblower should be the hero. Anybody who can, and basically, we shouldn't even sort of, in this day and age, of course, one is a hero to be a whistleblower because the blowback and the persecution that the establishment, the state, the government put upon these whistleblowers is often tremendous, and in the case of Julian Assange will probably end up his life will be taken. It's a gradual killing of Julian Assange is happening. And so I'm hoping that David McBride will get the support that is required and get from the public, and that people see that that it becomes a wider conversation, actually, about the whole purpose of why we are in these endless wars. Like the Afghanistan war is now going on to 19 years. 19 years, the longest war that the US has been involved in, and I think Australia has been involved in. And why are we involved in this? See, this is the thing. Where is the conversation in the... you don't get these conversations in the corporate-owned media, and that includes the Australian Broadcasting Commission, which is basically a government-owned. ABC is government-owned. You don't get any conversation about why we are just following into these wars and what caused these wars in the first place. They're usually always on lies. So we're in Afghanistan, and who knows why, really, at this point. And what business have we got being there? I mean, the Taliban is stronger than ever. And the Afghan government is a puppet of the US empire. So but they can sort out their own issues. Now we need to do reparations, not only for the 49 people, Afghanis who were murdered by these SAS forces, tortured and murdered, and their families. The families need reparations for that. I don't think any amount of money can really compensate for the kinds of, for taking of a life, but at least it's something. And then the whole country needs to be, there needs to be reparations for the destruction of that country. And basically now basically making it almost unlivable for a lot of people. If you watch the Michelle Flournoy, the video I did yesterday about Michelle Flournoy, who's supposed to be the Secretary of Defense, she so paternalistically and patronizingly said, oh, we have to stay, this is the US, we have to stay there until, they have some sort of security and peace, and that they can, basically bring in corporations and turn it into a neoliberal nightmare. That's what she's talking about, but she doesn't actually say that, but pretends we care about the humanitarian issues within Afghanistan. If we cared about it, we never would have invaded these people in the first place. The West going around sort of writing everything, sort of bringing democracy and freedom. Where is the challenging of that narrative? Anywhere in the Fourth Estate. This assumption that the West has beneficial motives for going into these countries. And speaking of meddling, speaking of Western imperialist meddling, I was happy to see that in Bolivia, which was the victim of a US-backed coup last year, and that was, they put in Janine Arnez into government, who was a Christian fascist, and basically there was a lot of slaughtering that happened, and COVID was out of control, and they don't care about the indigenous people there. Anyway, Janine Arnez, who was one of the coup leaders, has been caught trying to leave the country, and so hopefully she will see justice via the Bolivian judicial system, because you rarely see anybody who was ever involved in these kinds of things ever coming to justice. They're protected usually and gotten out by the US somehow, and they remain in the US and are protected by the US. Any of these meddlers. So anyway, back to David McBride. So I'm hoping that with this recent these revelations which were played on Four Corners, and he got the person who did the report got a Walkley Award. I'm sorry, I don't know his name. Four Corners is like unfortunately has gone awry and basically usually just presents the US narrative, whatever is in favor of the US. But in this case, they don't even mention the US. This is the amazing thing. You would think that there was nothing going on except for Australian war crimes, and this is where it becomes like a limited hangout. This whole expose, this whole whistleblower of the awful war crimes that the SAS, the Special Forces in Afghanistan, the Australian Special Forces, have done since 2012 in particular. This is like a limited hangout in a way, because really and I've said this before, I really feel like it's just trying to steadily release, like a release valve, release some information and make it look like the Australian government cares, make it look like it's all under control, that this was some aberration, and that once they've got this sorted out, once they bring these soldiers to justice, that everything is fine, as if the culture of the Special Armed Forces and that kind of thing, like as if it's all honourable. How can anything be honourable when you're doing the bidding of the US empire? How can anything be honourable? And anybody, no matter who they are, whether they think there's good SAS people and bad SAS people, or good Australian military and bad Australian military personnel, are not really being honest. They're not being honest about the whole assumption that any of these wars are just, that any of these wars have good motivation, that it's for humanitarian reasons. The US is always uses that excuse, humanitarian reasons. They try and do that in Venezuela. They try and pretend like they want to save the Venezuelan people from their government that they democratically elected, and the government is using resources for the people, unlike the US, who has basically abandoned its people, and the US is a failed state. Here's a failed state telling other countries what they should be doing. A failed state, the US, that cannot even support and give Medicare for all to the people, to the citizens of the country, even in a pandemic. The only Western country really who doesn't have any sort of free health care, telling other countries in the world how they should be running their countries. And then if they don't submit to the US empire, then the US empire goes in under false pretenses or backs up coups and overthrows their government and then turns it into a neoliberal nightmare, just like the US. I mean, it's outrageous. Let me just run through a few of these things that have happened in Afghanistan. War is a crime, but I'm going to briefly describe some of the individual abuses that are not aberrations. This is something that the US does all the time. This isn't an aberration, and that's something we all need to know, and we all need to expose the Australian government for engaging and joining in on these immoral wars. We need the public to know that these sort of things that the SAS were doing in Afghanistan are not aberrations. This is something that has been happening now for the last 19 years, and not only just in Afghanistan. You only have to look at and this is why in the last 9 days, according to David McBride on his YouTube channel, there's been 9 Australian veterans have killed themselves, and there's been about 300 or more over the years have killed themselves, Australian veterans. And David McBride, the whistleblower for these SAS crimes, war crimes, he helped expose these war crimes. He said the reason the Australian government doesn't want a Senate inquiry into this issue, into veteran suicides, is because they're afraid of what might come out. You see, it's all about, and you would know this if you follow this channel, it's all about controlling the narrative and making sure that people don't think too much about it, that the public doesn't think too much about it. And also, as I said, this is a limited hangout in a way because it's designed the way it is, the way it's actually being presented to the public, and the way Scott Morrison is going, oh, these are terrible things and we will, address them and all of this. This is a way of making sure the public don't question further what's been happening all along and question the fact that maybe this is something that is just normalized and normal, a normal goings on in any war that has been conducted by the West in any of these countries. We don't want that kind of questioning about the motives about why we are there, about maybe that this is normal and this isn't an aberration, what these SAS were doing to these Afghani citizens. We don't want those sort of conversations, because that would mean that the cracks would start to appear in this very carefully crafted propaganda that the US has been involved in, that Australia participates in. The West, basically the Western governments, all carefully craft this propaganda that they're doing these things for humanitarian reasons, that they really don't want to be there, in these countries, but they have to be, or they can't pull out because heavens knows it'll all fall apart, and yada, 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 all these excuses. But really why they're there is for resources and hegemony in that region, and also to have strategic positions so that when they decide at some point to go further, like invade Iran, which it looks like Donald Trump wants to do before he leaves office, because he's Sheldon Adelson is his biggest donor, and Sheldon Adelson has always had this aim of invading Iran. So there's a bit of a quid pro quo. I give you millions and millions of dollars to become president, and now it's payback time. If you're going to be kicked out, if you're going to leave in January 20th, Donald Trump, you have to pay back and invade Iran, or do something that is going to cause an invasion. And just only yesterday, an Iranian nuclear scientist, the fifth one now over the years, and Obama's administration killed, I think, 4 Iranian nuclear scientists. Well, there was one just killed recently. And of course, then there was the Qasem Soleimani assassination. These are all attempts to start a war with Iran, and thank goodness the Iranian government is the adult in the room and doesn't take the bait. But they're trying to create a war with Iran, and I fear Donald Trump is going to try and do something just before he leaves, even if he thinks that may even keep him in office, because it's, he'll consider himself a wartime president or something. I don't think there's much chance of that, but I'm just saying there needs to be a much broader conversation about what's this, much beyond this presentation that this is some sort of aberration that's happened with special SAS forces in Afghanistan. I mean, you only have to listen to Eyes Left podcast and listen to Clifton Hicks, who I think was describing, it was either Iraq or Afghanistan, and he was saying how, they went into a town. He's a vet. They went into a town and there was dead animals laying all over the road. There was hundreds of people were dead, and they basically had a free fire zone in this town. I think it was Abu Ghraib, the actual town, and they just killed everybody in the town, a free fire zone, and the animals included.
Happened a lot of times. We did this in smaller areas. One troop would cordon off a town or a village or a neighborhood or a few city blocks in Baghdad, and another troop would go in and do the raiding, knocking down doors, walls, and whatever was supposed to happen, with the idea that the attacking troop would do the main killing and the fighting and flush everybody out. And when they fled, they would encounter the other troops' vehicles at roadblocks and OPs and ambush points, and they would get either killed or captured trying to flee. So that's what we did here. One of the other troops cordoned off, I guess, the whole town of Abu Ghraib, while my troop, C Troop, Comanche Troop, went in. And they called it a recon in force. We were basically just going to go, and because this was an area where I believe it was the 1st Cavalry Division had been pushed out, and there had been no coalition troops there for weeks. So they said that, and then they also said explicitly, I wrote this down in my little notebook, that there were no friendlies in the area. There were no coalition forces, and there were no civilians in the area. They said that all the civilians had already fled and been evacuated, and if we saw anybody, to just go ahead and shoot them. As though we went in, and the first few times we went into the town, I was down in the driver's hole in the tank, all buttoned up, and nobody on my tank ever did any shooting because we didn't see anybody. It was just devastated, deserted, empty city. I had never seen anything like it, and never have seen anything like it. This whole town was completely destroyed. It looked like Stalingrad, the old pictures that I'd seen. There was nothing, hardly anything left standing. Every single structure was full of holes. All the windows had burn damage, where the fire had come out of the windows. There was rubble everywhere. There was more corpses laying around, dead people, dead dogs. I even saw a dead horse or two. It was just devastated. And so this is at a point where I really started to get sick of what I was doing. It was pretty disgusting. And I got news that several of my friends had been killed in the uprising in different units. And I was really not having it. I was really upset. A lot of guys in my unit did express, that they wanted revenge. And apparently some guys in some of the platoons did get that revenge by hosing down those civilian vehicles. There was one Bradley crew in particular that did the most shooting that I heard about, and they used their coax machine gun on every single car they saw, every person they saw. So those guys got, quote, revenge. But I didn't have those feelings because I had already figured out that the people who were fighting us were defending their own country. They were fighting back against an army that had no business being there. I'd already figured out in those days, and I was already starting to vocalize it, that the war was wrong and that we should not have come there and we shouldn't be there anymore. And that every single person who was dying in this war, Iraqi, American, everybody else, that it was a waste, that it was a crime. And so I didn't have feelings of wanting revenge. It just gave me that sick, hollow, empty feeling inside of me. And I, very quickly was basically, I was just obsessed with getting out of there alive and with helping my friends get out of there alive. But after that, once we went back and I saw that devastation in Abu Ghraib and I saw the city that was just leveled, people who, could not return to their homes, who were desperately trying to flee the battlefield, I lost any desire to want to engage in that anymore. And I started to vocalize my feelings.
You identified not just with the Iraqi civilians, but you identified with the Iraqis that were fighting and trying to kill you and kill your friend.
Yeah, I think that was maybe what was the most disturbing to my chain of command, was when they started to hear that, when I did speak, like I said, I wasn't speaking a lot, but I started to speak again. And I made very sure in those days when I did speak, it was to say what, the truth. And I did begin to identify more with the guys that we were fighting than, with my own chain of command. I started to really notice that, our president, our commander-in-chief, was a joke and a coward who'd never been through anything like this before. George Bush had never had to do any of this stuff before. A lot of our, senior officers in our chain of command, they'd never had to do anything like this before either. And yet they were ordering us to do it, to just go and kill these guys who were defending their own neighborhoods and their own communities. It was pretty disgusting, and it was very clear to me at the time, what was happening. I realized that I was on the wrong side. If the only people who were justified in that war were the insurgents, the Iraqis, the foreigners, as unsavory as they were, the foreigners who came to help them fight us, those were the freedom fighters. Those were the guys who actually had a reason to fight. Me, I had no reason to fight.
All of these things, war is a crime, but these are war crimes. Every single one of these things, the whole thing is immoral. And that's where the conversation needs to go. Not only that, but, and I'm very happy to see that there's all these different countries are embracing this multipolar world. The US wants a unipolar world. They want to call the shots for everybody. And if they can't do that, then they're going to create it's like a bully stomping around doing a tantrum because all these countries are organizing without them. So one of the biggest trade deals went through just recently with Asian countries, China, Japan, South Korea, and it was a huge trade deal, and the US wasn't involved in it. And that's what we need to have going. These countries need to organize without the US, and Russia and China, Iran, they all need to band together against this immense, monstrous bully, this insatiable monster that wants to basically eat the world up and ecocide with its end-stage capitalism, and it wants to have a full spectrum dominance. And that's what Michelle Flournoy was talking about. She wants full spectrum dominance. She wants a permanent war. This is Michelle Flournoy, the Biden selection for Secretary of Defense. These are the sort of characters that they get into office because this is the aim of US empire, is full spectrum dominance at any cost. And that's why they have the CIA. The CIA has been doing this disturbing stuff since World War II. helping overthrow governments and putting in dictators and trying to basically eventually, look at the 50 plus countries now they've meddled in since World War II and overthrown governments or attempted to overthrow governments. So, when are we going to have that conversation? When are we going to have that conversation in Australia about the nefarious motives of any administration in the US government, whether it's Democrat or Republican? We need to have that conversation. And I long for the day that we do. The people, and I think it is coming, because Australia's going to be left out in the cold with this insane empire, backing up this insane empire. We're going to be left isolated with them. And they don't give a toss about us. They only care that we're helping them out with their raping and pillaging and destruction of these countries that haven't submitted to US empire. So, I feel like there's some shift happening because it's becoming a multipolar world, and because China and Russia are getting together, and Iran, Iran is sending, is it Venezuela? Venezuela is sending oil to China. Now, it's sad that we're still using fossil fuels, but I'm just talking about the terrible sanctions that the US has placed on Venezuela, which has killed 40,000 plus people. The numbers are different. I know I heard 100,000 at one point, but it's definitely been 40,000 since 2017. Economic sanctions are an act of war, and the US has put dreadful economic sanctions on Venezuela because Venezuela will not submit to US empire. And they put on terrible sanctions on Iran, 800 sanctions that are crippling, and they're in a pandemic. This is the sadistic nature of US empire. So anyway, some of these crimes that the SAS, Australian SAS, were involved in. I'm going to show you some little clips from Four Corners, the show that was basically about this, about the SAS crimes, and which I think is a limited hangout, just to control the conversation and make it look like we're all sort of really dealing with this aberration. So some of the things that happened. So, for example, the SAS would go into a village, and they'd round up the boys and the older men, and they'd take them to some area, and then they would torture them for days. And then eventually, people would find these old men and young men dead. They'd murdered them. There was 10 teenagers. They slashed the throats of these 2 teenagers in this village, and then they dumped them in the river. I saw one where they basically just shoot animals everywhere, like shoot dogs. It doesn't matter if the dog is a family companion of some family. They just shoot them. And there was one dog was inside a house, and they shot and killed this dog. And there was a child who was holding a dog, and they shot the dog while the child was patting the dog. These are abominations, really. And as a vegan, I find it just disgusting and as traumatic as if I was watching somebody being killed. A person, like a human person as opposed to a non-human person. And person simply means a sentient being that is not a thing. And animals are not things. Non-human animals are not things. So I find that very distressing. And I'll probably skip showing you that bit where a soldier just shoots this dog repeatedly, and you can hear the dog whimpering because wasn't killed outright, the dog wasn't killed outright. It's just awful. And who knows how many rapes have taken place. I mean, I'm sure there has to be rape in there somewhere for these SAS people. If you don't believe in taking prisoners, you can see a situation where they basically have these Afghanis cornered in this sort of a bunker type thing, and then they throw a thermo grenade inside the bunker. And thermo grenades take all the oxygen out of the air, and then it just basically sets everything on fire, and it also just turns people's insides to jelly. That's what one soldier described it as. Just turns people's insides to jelly, and it takes them minutes to die because it doesn't seem to affect the brain for some reason. It's just so sadistic. And they could have taken these people prisoners.
That patrol that came under fire, they had a Wakunish with them. He was killed pretty much instantly and right in front of the entrance to the mud hut. I believe there are at least 4 people in there, maybe 5. And there was one guy with a PKM who was laying in the entrance, and he was just firing out the entire time until they started throwing grenades in there.
One Australian soldier wants to throw in a thermal grenade and destroy the entire structure.
Another one! Get the fuck out of the way, cunt!
Leading the charge is an SAS operator who we'll call Soldier A.
And even as other soldiers came in to assist, and they had grenades with them. He was like, give me the grenade. And they were handing him over to him and he was finishing it off. And he was telling everyone else to get back.
Why was he so fired up?
He started it and he wanted to finish it.
Get the fuck out of the way, cunt! Get out of there!
I'm not sure what his mindset is, but it seems almost like a bloodlust once you get to that stage.
One soldier wants to get an attack helicopter to send a Hellfire missile into the bunker.
Oh, we can pull back and hellfire.
Soldier A then begins firing through a hole into the bunker.
Well, let's get him out of here. I got him, mate. Let's drag him out. Go.
Soldier A orders one of the SAS corporals to throw in a thermal grenade.
Once he got his thermo grenade in, it completely collapsed the mud hut. And from there, yeah, he just kept spraying.
You fucking dog.
They were no longer firing once the thermo grenade went off. Those things turn your insides to jelly.
Dusty, here.
The battle over, the SAS medic Dusty can finally get to the Afghan Wakunish soldier who's been shot at the front of the bunker.
Hey, he's fucking dead.
He's pissed.
Is he?
Because it's going on fucking stupid way.
No. Mate, there was no way you were going to get in that door without him getting a burst.
Yeah. That's it.
It was just right making sure he went first. Fortunes of war. Unfortunately, mate, it's their fucking country. That's unfortunate, but it's their fucking country.
So after we lost that whacker, it was a few days later, we went on another mission. I was with that soldier. It was his target. We went in. I confirmed that this Afghani national was the target. I was going through the rest of his equipment just to see what else he had. And then that soldier with a Wakunish, they marched that Afghani national who was, I confirmed he was the target. They marched him about 50 metres away or so. Then the soldier ordered the prisoner to kneel back on the ground. He then motioned for the Wakunish soldier to shoot him. The soldier kind of looked at him confused, asking, wondering what he's telling him to do. And then he did it again, and then he understood what was happening. And then the soldier ordered the Wakunish to execute him. And so he just quick burst straight into his chest area.
And killed a man.
Killed the man.
And the man was handcuffed, plastic cuffed.
He was still plastic cuffed at that stage.
And you witnessed this, you could physically see this.
I could, yeah.
And what does the Australian SAS operative say after this?
He said I had to give him a win.
What did he mean by that?
Because they just lost one of their members, give them a win, let them have something.
What are you thinking?
At the time, I was just like, okay, we're executing people now.
This is the other thing that is never discussed. Why are there insurgents? They call them insurgents. I don't know. Maybe it's because we're occupying their country and bombing and killing their families, droning them. There wasn't even a mention of how much drone killing there is. Droning wedding parties and funeral processions and then double tapping them, going back and killing the people that come to their aid. That sort of thing. That goes on all the time, drone killings. And they're not even keeping count of how many civilians are being killed now. Donald Trump has taken that away. Well, there's been 98% of people who are killed in drone killings are civilians. So maybe it's got something to do with that. Just maybe. Maybe people are, joining up, to become an insurgent, in quotes. Because the US empire is going in and occupying their country and killing their families, droning them, destroying their houses and their infrastructure, and basically putting in their own puppet government, and then taking over and bringing in corporations and stealing their resources. Maybe it's got something to do with that. Just maybe. Maybe it's just got something to do with what every other person probably on the planet might think about doing, joining an insurgency, because some horrific monstrous empire is going around and trying to destroy their whole country. Honestly and truly, I would think that's the case. And so here they are punishing, and this is something that's never talked about either in Australian media or anywhere else. That, you know, Michelle Flournoy uses this word insurgents, putting down insurgents. What an absolute ridiculous notion that people wouldn't want to join an insurgency against an occupying destructive force that is destroying their country and their families. The fact that we can't even seem to recognize that it's like if they do it, then they are terrorists and insurgents. But if we were doing that, if we were fighting against an occupying force like this, then that's totally justifiable, and people who do that are heroes. This is what I mean. It's insane. The narrative in this is insane, and it's racist, and it's xenophobic. Of course people would want to join an insurgency. So they're punishing people for fighting back against a humongous bully, punishing them, turning their insides to jelly, and then shooting, and then after they throw that thermo grenade in the bunker and then start shooting them, you know, like, which I guess in some ways is probably humane, because this is the awfulness of it, because those people are probably desperately suffering if they're not dead already. But I mean, isn't it disgusting? So disgusting. What are we doing? And I'm appalled that we're involved in this here in Australia. I'm appalled. And there is no pushback against this. There's no pushback against the US government from any of these political parties. They have no moral center, really. That for all the carryings on they do, they just allow this to go on unabated. And there are all these soldiers in Australia killing themselves because they can't live with really basically what they've been doing over there. That's the bottom line. 20 soldiers, or is it 22 soldiers a day, veterans in the US, kill themselves every day. Why is that? Apart from the injuries that are not, apart from the awful injuries, the psychological PSD, the PSD that is happening because of what they've seen, what they've been engaged in. You know, they've seen basically the humanity sucked out of everything. Anything that is human, anything that is good, has been probably sucked out of their life because they've been involved in the most depraved and morally bankrupt things. For what reason? For, as Smedley Butler said, you know, for all the things that Smedley Butler talked about, what soldiers are used for, to help the oligarchy, basically. All these wars are all about just helping the oligarchy. Even the so-called justifiable war of World War II. Read about David Swanson's book about that. So anyway, you know, there are some other things. I'll see if I can pull out some clips just at the end of this to show you what kind of things that the Australians were involved in, the SAS forces. And just know, it's not an aberration. This is not unusual, and it happens all the time, like the collateral murder video that Chelsea Manning, the many things that whistleblower Chelsea Manning gave to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and mowing down people from a helicopter, just civilians. 2 of them were Reuters journalists. That is normal. This sort of thing goes on all the time, every day, in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So until we start being honest with ourselves about really why we are there, why we are engaged in these US imperialist wars, that it actually is imperialism and it's about hegemony and stealing resources, until we are honest with ourselves here in Australia and throughout the world in other Western countries, then nothing is ever going to change. That's why it's so important that we don't allow something like this with this Australian SAS war crimes. We don't allow it to go by. We don't allow them to frame the narrative that it's some sort of aberration. We need to push it for all we're worth, like catching a wave. We need to catch this wave into shore and make sure that everybody that hears about this knows this is not an aberration. This is not unusual. This is normal. This is normal for Western imperialist wars, and they must end. They must end now, and we can do this. We can do this, the public. We can't leave it up to these weak-willed politicians who are careerists. We have to do something, you and I, to bring an end to this. And it starts with education. It starts with exposing this and broadening the discussion, so that it stops being controlled by the establishment.
The information the SAS relied on to capture or kill their targets was often vague.
We would get intelligence briefs. They would be saying stuff like, fist-length beard, wearing Afghani clothes. Just really basic descriptions of people, unless they had a photo, which they didn't always, and more times than not they didn't.
So it could be anyone in the population?
No idea who it is. But most of the time it was a really simple description of the average Afghani man.
A squirter is the nickname for Afghans assumed to be enemy combatants who are running for cover. Soldier A heads for the target.
I was with his patrol again. We were moving through a village. We were coming up on the target building. I didn't see him walk out of that target building, but he was about 10 metres away from it, walking from that direction across our position. When we got to within maybe 20 to 30 metres away and he saw us, he quickly grabbed his phone from his pocket and he threw it. And at that stage he stopped, he put his hands up just like that, and then just stood there. As we got closer to him, the soldier then just fired and hit him twice in the chest and then shot him through the head as he walked past him. And then from there, he just moved on. I was only 5 to 10 metres behind him at the time. And at the time, I was just like, okay, the visual image to me was the guy had his hands up and then it was almost like target practice for that soldier.
After the killing, Braden Chapman was ordered to go through the dead Afghans' pockets and to find the phone the man had thrown away.
That incident was pretty gruesome because another patrol joined us not long after and they had one of their assault dogs with them, and it actually came and started chewing on the head of the man who'd been shot. And I remember looking to the dog handler saying, "Can you get this thing away from it?" Because it was pretty gruesome. And he's just like, "Oh, I'll let him have a taste." So we landed on the far side of the building we ended up processing people on. Just walking through the village, there was there was actually a public meeting going on, so we walked over, the interpreter spoke to them, we moved on. We knew there was a couple of shootings over in the distance.
2 Afghans were killed by the SAS patrol. Defence investigators later concluded that one of the dead men had been carrying a grenade, the other an assault rifle. Braden Chapman came upon Haji Sada after the Afghan had been shot and was being treated by an SAS medic. He then saw the wounded man being taken away by an SAS operator, who we'll call Soldier B.
Where was he shot?
Through the leg, but it wasn't life-threatening. And the medic, once he'd put bandages and stuff on him, he was good to go. Senior soldier walked over, grabbed the Afghani, and then moved him off down an alleyway. I saw him go into, I wasn't sure if it was a door, it was some type of doorway, but it could have been another alleyway. And then sometime later, he came back and our medic asked him, like, what happened? Where is he? Because he'd worked on him, he considered him his patient. And then he just shook his head and said he didn't make it.
He didn't make it?
He didn't make it.
What happened then?
I know the medic was pretty upset because he knew what had happened.
What sort of discussion was had about it, if any?
He was just saying that the man was fine, there's no way he would have died, and he knew that the soldier had killed him. And that was basically it.
Villagers have told Four Corners that they heard Haji Sada crying out and later found him dead with severe bruising around the chest. The Afghan investigation found he'd been beaten to death.
What if I told you that there was a later defence inquiry into that killing and they found that killing was totally justifiable? What's your response to that?
I'd say that someone's lied, giving evidence, because there's no way that you can justify an execution.
Do you believe there was a culture of covering these things up? It's not just the incident, but it's the cover-up. Is there cover-up?
Yeah, definitely. When you're back at the unit, people would make jokes about the size of the rug that they've swept everything under, and that one day it'll all come out. And, people are going to be thrown in jail for murder or anything else that they've done. He was the soldier who told me that I need to be prepared for him to put a gun to someone's head and pull the trigger. And he was the same soldier who was violent to a lot of other Afghanis as well. So it didn't honestly surprise me that had happened.
Braden Chapman says he saw Soldier B punch a child in the face and confront another boy with a dog.
It was on top of a mountain and there was just an old man and a young child up there and their dog. The dog was barking, but on a leash, and he told the boy to hold the chain up near towards the head so that he could hold it still, and then he shot the dog right in front of the child.
So he shot the dog as the child was holding it?
Yes.
When my father finished his prayer, they kicked him in the head while he was trying to stand up. His turban fell down and they stood him up. They tore his turban up into pieces and tied up the hands of the other people in the mosque. They beat me up and they said, "Why are you standing here? What did he give you?" I said, "He didn't give me anything." They beat me up very badly and told me, "Go home. Why are you standing here?"
Throughout the village, men were rounded up by the Australians.
When they came to the mosque, they arrested us, including the mullah. He was handcuffed and blindfolded.
They were standing behind us. We were not allowed to talk. There was an interpreter with them. He was talking to us. Guns were pointed at our mouths.
Blindfolded, the men rounded up by the SAS listened as the Australians carried out their raid.
They were firing shots and kicking doors. So people didn't know whether it was a shot or the door being kicked.
By the end of the raid, Haji Raz Muhammad and his son Abdul Jalil were dead.
People told me about my brother, Abdul Jalil. There was a corner. A soldier was waiting at that corner and he shot my brother in the mouth from a distance. They shot him with another bullet in his heart. My father was shot with one bullet in the side of the head and another in the side of his body.
We found the son in the night after the Australians left at 4 o'clock. And we found the father in the morning. There were fig trees. He was shot among the fig trees and nobody saw him. When the sun rose in the morning, we found him. They were shot in the head and laying down like this.
Four Corners has obtained this video of the dead men, which shows terrible injuries to both.
According to our investigation, none of these two people were involved in any military activity or in combat.
Also being investigated is whether a radio was then planted on the dead man's body in order to justify the killing. The Inspector General of the ADF is investigating whether the planting of radios or ICOMs was common practice. Braden Chapman says it was.
So often I'd get calls over the radio to see if I'd picked any up. We couldn't really plant the ICOMs I carried on an Afghani because they were too clean. Afghani's equipment is always dirty, so you can't really plant clean equipment. I never actually handed over any, but I did see plenty that were planted.
So you saw radios planted on dead Afghans?
Yeah, they hadn't got them off me, but they definitely got them off somebody else and walked over and sat it next to a body. We could actually shoot people who were reporting on our position. So if they had an ICOM and were reporting on us, we could actually fire upon them. Other members of my troop back in Australia, they did used to joke about how the same serial number was in every single photo of a dead Afghani.
So the same serial number on a gun?
Yeah, so inferring that somebody was planting these AK-47s.
The helmet camera footage you're seeing is from the SAS patrol dog handler. And what you will see next could result in charges of war crimes. The dog handler heads out into the lead with the patrol scout, who we'll call Soldier C.
Hey, Sam's over there.
They are being guided by the two Black Hawks ahead, whose crew have spotted a man in a field. The dog, named Quake, is then let off the leash.
Hey, come! Let's in the body car! Quiet down!
The dog handler's gun is trained on a figure in the distance who drops down into the field. At the field, the dog handler and Soldier C come across a young man amongst the wheat who's trying to fight off Quake.
Quiet! Leave! Quiet!
In the man's hand appears to be a set of red prayer beads. No weapon or radio can be seen. The Afghan is compliant and quiet on the ground.
Down.
As the dog is called off, Soldier C trains his weapon on the Afghan from very close range. He then turns to the dog handler.
Quick, no! Quick! Stop! Leave! Quick! Leave! Heal.
3 shots from close range. The Afghan is dead, and Soldier C walks off.
No! Heal!
The whole thing, from landing to killing, takes less than 3 minutes.
Heal! Heal! Quick, no! Quick! Stop! Leave!
So he shot the Afghan. Did you know about this? Or
I didn't know.
You haven't seen this before?
I have not.
And do you know who those soldiers are?
I do, yeah.
And he was well held, and he's turned to his superior officer over here. He said, "Do you want me to drop this cunt?" And he says that 3 times. In your mind, what do you make of that whole situation?
It's just a straight up execution, really. Yeah, he's asked someone of a superior rank what he should do, but it comes down to the soldier pulling the trigger, and it's a straight up execution.
He was in a shroud. Because of my grief, I was sitting over there. I asked, "Where is he?" And they said, "He's there." I went to see. His face had wounds. I covered his face and told them to take him to the graveyard. After his burial, I came back to see the place. I saw the wheat field where he was killed. The wheat was flattened all around.
The death of the man, named Dad Muhammad, was later investigated by the Defence Force after Afghan tribal elders complained. What the ADF investigators were told by SAS soldiers and what the video shows are 2 very different things. Soldier C claimed that the Afghan had been shot because he'd been seen with a radio. He said he engaged the Afghan from 15 to 20 metres away in self-defence. The investigators found that the Afghan was lawfully killed because he posed a direct threat to the Australians. 4 Corners can reveal that Soldier C, who killed the Afghan, is still serving in the Special Forces.
They're going to look back and see that we were the guys in there murdering and invading and not there to do something that is honourable.